The phone rang at 2:47 a.m., shattering the silence of Hudson Vaughn's modest apartment. A woman's trembling voice whispered through the line, "Please ... Stay with me tonight. I don't want to die alone." He should have hung up. It was clearly a wrong number. But something in her voice, the raw fear, the desperate loneliness stopped him. That single mistaken call would unravel everything Hudson thought he knew about justice, wealth, and the woman the world believed had everything, because the terrified voice on the other end belonged to Alana Reeves, the dying heiress to the Reeves pharmaceutical empire. And the secret she was about to share with a complete stranger would expose a conspiracy that had poisoned thousands, destroyed families, and hidden behind boardroom doors for decades. Sometimes the wrong number is exactly the right call. And sometimes a single conversation at 3 a.m. can change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Alana Reeves pressed her palm against the penthouse window, the glass cold beneath her fevered skin. Below, the lights of Ashmont City sprawled like fallen stars, indifferent to her private catastrophe. Her reflection stared back, a ghost of the woman who had graced magazine covers just 18 months ago. The aggressive lymphoma had stripped away everything superficial, revealing bones too sharp beneath translucent skin, eyes too large in a hollowed face. The penthouse felt like a gilded cage tonight. 42 floors above the world, surrounded by priceless art and designer furniture, yet more alone than she had ever been. Her phone sat on the marble counter, its screen dark and accusatory. 23 contacts. 23 people she could theoretically call. Not one of them would answer at this hour with genuine concern. Her father, Harrison Reeves, was somewhere in Geneva, attending yet another pharmaceutical conference. Her stepmother, Kendall, had made her disinterest clear months ago when she stopped visiting the hospital. The board members who once courted her favor now avoided her calls, uncomfortable with mortality's reminder. Her former friends had drifted away when she could no longer attend galas and charity auctions. When her illness became too real, too awkward to acknowledge, the pain medication was wearing off. Alana could feel the familiar ache spreading through her bones, a dull throb that would soon sharpen into agony. Dr. Patterson had adjusted her dosage yesterday, but the relief never lasted long enough. She was supposed to call the night nurse if the pain became unbearable. The number sat programmed in her phone under medical emergency. But tonight, Alana didn't want a nurse with practiced sympathy and efficient needles. She wanted something she couldn't name, something that felt increasingly impossible to find. Connection, perhaps, or simply proof that she existed as more than a dying heiress, more than a tragic footnote in the Reeves family legacy. Her fingers moved across the phone screen without conscious thought, muscle memory guiding them. She meant to call the night nurse. She was certain of it. But her vision blurred. Whether from tears or medication, she couldn't tell. The numbers swam together. She pressed what she thought was the right contact and lifted the phone to her ear. It rang once, twice, 3 times. A man's voice answered, rough with sleep and confusion. "Hello." The sound of another human voice, unprepared and genuinely caught off guard, broke something in Alana. "Please," she whispered, her carefully maintained composure crumbling. "Stay with me tonight. I don't want to die alone." Silence stretched between them. She could hear him breathing, could almost feel his hesitation crackling through the connection. "Who is this?" he asked, more gently now. Alana opened her mouth to apologize, to end the call and dial the correct number. Instead, she found herself sinking onto the imported Italian leather sofa, phone pressed desperately to her ear. "Someone who made a mistake," she admitted. "I'm sorry. I meant to call someone else. Are you okay?" The question held genuine concern, not the practiced sympathy she'd grown to hate. "You said something about dying." The laugh that escaped her was bitter and broken. I'm dying, yes. Lymphoma, stage 4. The doctors give me weeks, maybe a month if I'm unlucky. She didn't know why she was telling this to a stranger. Perhaps because he was a stranger. Someone who owed her nothing, expected nothing, and therefore couldn't disappoint her. I'm sorry, he said. And somehow, through the phone line, she believed him. They sat in silence, connected by accident and sustained by something neither could explain. Alana could hear sounds in the background, the distant hum of traffic, the creak of what might be old floorboards. Not a penthouse, she realized. Somewhere more modest, more real. What's your name? She asked suddenly, a pause. Hudson. Hudson Vaughn. I'm Alana. She didn't give her last name. For once, she wanted to be just Alana, not the Reeves heiress, not the dying daughter of pharmaceutical royalty. Alana, he repeated, as if testing how it felt. It's almost 3 in the morning. Is there someone who should be with you? Family? Friends? There's no one, she said simply. The truth of it settled over her like a shroud. My father is overseas. My stepmother doesn't visit anymore. The nurses are efficient, but they're paid to care. I wanted to talk to someone who wasn't obligated to pretend concern. Hudson was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight she recognized, the sound of someone who understood loss intimately. I know something about being alone, he said. Different reasons maybe, but I understand that feeling. Alana pulled a cashmere throw over her legs, suddenly cold despite the penthouse's perfect climate control. Through the windows, Ashmont City continued its indifferent glitter. Tell me about your day, she said impulsively. Not the tragic parts. Just normal things. I'd like to remember what normal feels like. She heard him shift, could picture him sitting up in bed, perhaps wondering if he was dealing with a prank call or something more serious. My day was pretty standard, he began slowly. I work at a commercial bakery, early morning shifts. Today I was making sourdough, about 300 loaves. The smell of fresh bread is probably the best part of the job. That sounds nice, Alana said, closing her eyes. She tried to imagine it, the warmth of ovens, the yeast and flour scent, the simple satisfaction of creating something people would enjoy. Her world had been reduced to hospital rooms, lab results, and the stark minimalism of her penthouse prison. It is, mostly. Hard on the back, but honest work. Hudson paused. Look, Alana, I don't know your situation exactly, but if you're really sick and really alone right now, maybe I should call someone for you. A doctor or emergency services? No, she said quickly. Please, no. I have doctors, more than I need. I have nurses on call, medications that cost more than most people's cars. What I don't have is someone to talk to at 3 in the morning who isn't paid to listen. Okay, Hudson said gently. Then I'll stay on the line. As long as you need. Alana felt tears sliding down her face, but for once they weren't tears of self-pity or fear. They were tears of relief, of unexpected kindness from an accidental source. Why? She asked. You don't know me. This could be a prank. I could be anyone. Maybe, Hudson acknowledged. But you sound like someone who needs help, and I'm awake anyway. Sometimes that's enough. They talked through the night, two strangers connected by wrong numbers and right timing. Alana didn't mention her family name or her father's empire. Hudson didn't push for details she wasn't ready to share. They existed in a bubble of anonymity, free from context and judgment. As dawn approached, painting the penthouse windows with soft gold light, Alana realized something fundamental had shifted. She had spent months surrounded by people who knew exactly who she was and treated her accordingly. Hudson knew nothing except what she chose to reveal, and somehow that made his presence more real than anything she'd experienced in months. Will you call again? Hudson asked as the city began its morning awakening. Alana looked at her phone. at the number that had been dialed by mistake but felt increasingly like destiny. "Yes," she whispered. "If that's okay." "It's okay," Hudson said. "Get some rest, Alana." Hudson Vaughn set his phone on the kitchen counter and stared at it as though it might explain what had just happened. The screen showed a call duration of 4 hours and 17 minutes. 4 hours talking to a dying woman whose last name he didn't know, whose face he'd never seen, whose voice had somehow bypassed all his carefully constructed defenses. The apartment was silent except for the old refrigerator's familiar hum. Through the thin walls, he could hear his neighbor's television already blaring morning news. Hudson glanced at the clock. 6:23 a.m. His daughter Bailey would be awake soon, expecting breakfast before her bus arrived at 7:30. He needed to function normally, to pretend the last 4 hours hadn't happened. But Alana's voice echoed in his mind. The way it had broken when she said she was dying. The desperate loneliness beneath her cultured accent and expensive vocabulary. Hudson recognized that particular brand of isolation. He'd felt it himself in the months after Sarah died, when people stopped calling because they didn't know what to say anymore, when sympathy cards tapered off and life moved forward for everyone except him. He started coffee, the ritual automatic after years of early morning shifts. The bakery expected him at 4 a.m. most days, but today was his day off. He'd planned to catch up on sleep, maybe take Bailey to that new science museum she'd been mentioning. Instead, he'd spent the night on the phone with a stranger who dialed his number by mistake, preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, except it hadn't felt like a mistake. Their conversation had flowed with surprising ease once Alana relaxed. She'd asked about his work, his life, seeming genuinely interested in the mundane details most people found boring. He'd told her about the satisfaction of watching dough rise, the precise timing required for perfect crust, the camaraderie among the night shift bakers. Normal things, as she'd requested in return. She'd shared carefully edited pieces of herself. A love of classical piano she no longer had strength to play. A view from her apartment that made the city look like a jewelry box. Books she was reading, knowing she might never finish them. The fear that kept her awake at night, not of death itself, but of dying without having truly lived. Hudson hadn't pushed for more. He understood the need for boundaries, for controlling what others knew about your pain. After Sarah's death, he'd become an expert at deflecting concern, at appearing fine when everything felt shattered. Bailey emerged from her room at exactly 6:45, right on schedule. At 12, she'd inherited her mother's punctuality and Hudson's quiet determination. She paused in the kitchen doorway, studying him with the unsettling perception that sometimes made him forget how young she was. "You look tired," she observed, heading for the cereal cabinet. "Bad dreams?" "Couldn't sleep," Hudson said, which was technically true. He poured orange juice while Bailey assembled her breakfast with practiced efficiency. "How'd you sleep?" "Fine. I finished the history paper, by the way. It's in my folder." She crunched through her cereal, already mentally moving through her day. "Can we go to the museum this weekend?" "Emma went last month and said the planetarium show is amazing." "Sure, Bailebug. Saturday work for you?" She nodded, satisfied, and the conversation moved to normal morning territory. School projects, permission slips, the ongoing drama with Emma's science lab partner. Hudson participated automatically, but part of his mind remained fixed on that phone call, on Alana's request that he call her again. Should he? The rational part of his brain argued against it. She was clearly wealthy, educated, probably from a completely different world. They had nothing in common except insomnia and loneliness. Getting involved with someone who was dying seemed like volunteering for heartbreak he didn't need, but another part of him, the part that remembered what genuine isolation felt like, Couldn't forget the relief in her voice when he'd agreed to stay on the line. What harm could a few phone calls do? She needed someone to talk to. He happened to be available. It didn't have to be complicated. After dropping Bailey at the bus stop, Hudson returned to the apartment and stared at his phone. He didn't have her number. She'd called him, and his phone showed unknown caller in the history. If they were going to talk again, she'd have to initiate it. The day passed in typical fashion. Laundry, grocery shopping, paying bills online. Hudson forced himself not to check his phone every 5 minutes, not to wonder if Alana was okay, if she'd met her request for him to call again, or if daylight had brought regret about her 3 a.m. vulnerability. By evening, he'd convinced himself she wouldn't call. It had been an anomaly, a moment of weakness she'd probably rather forget. His phone rang at 9:17 p.m. Unknown caller flashed on the screen. Hudson's heart rate kicked up as he answered. Hello. Alana's voice came through, stronger than last night, but carrying an uncertain edge. I wasn't sure if I should call. If you were serious about talking again, I was serious. He moved to the living room sofa, settling in. Bailey was already in bed, reading with her door cracked open. How are you feeling? Tired. The pain is manageable tonight. She paused. I've been thinking about our conversation. About how strange it is that I feel more comfortable talking to you than people I've known for years. Hudson understood exactly what she meant. Strangers don't have expectations, he said. They don't need you to be anyone except who you are right now. Yes, Alana breathed. Exactly that. They talked for 2 hours. Alana asked about Bailey this time, and Hudson found himself describing his daughter's fierce independence, her scientific mind, the way she approached problems with Sarah's logical precision. Talking about Sarah had been difficult for years, but Alana's gentle questions made it easier somehow. She sounds remarkable, Alana said warmly. You must be proud. I am. She's the best thing I ever did. Hudson hesitated, then asked what he'd been wondering all day. Alana, are you really alone in this? No family at all? The silence stretched long enough that he thought he'd overstepped. Finally she spoke, her voice careful. My father and I are estranged, more or less. He's very successful, very busy. My mother died when I was young. My stepmother tolerates me at best. She laughed without humor. It's complicated. Family often is. True enough, Hudson agreed, thinking of his own distant parents who'd never approved of Sarah, who'd sent a card when she died but hadn't visited since. Can I tell you something? Alana asked suddenly. Something I haven't told anyone else? Of course. I'm scared, she whispered. Not of dying exactly, but of leaving nothing behind. Of being forgotten as soon as I'm gone. Is that selfish? Hudson's throat tightened. It's human, he said. We all want to matter. Do you think I still can? Matter, I mean. With time running out, he considered the question seriously. I think you matter right now, to someone. Isn't that enough? Hudson Vaughn's story didn't begin with tragedy, though that's what defined his recent years in most people's minds. It began with ordinary middle-class contentment, the kind that felt so secure you never thought to appreciate it until it was gone. He'd grown up in Brookhaven, a mid-sized town 2 hours north of Ashmont City, the son of 2 accountants who valued stability above all else. They'd envisioned a safe path for their only son, college, corporate job, suburban house, grandkids eventually. Hudson had followed the script dutifully through his business degree at Brookhaven State, accepting a position at a mid-tier insurance firm straight out of graduation. Then, he'd met Sarah Lynn at a community theater audition. She was there with friends, dragged along for moral support, despite having no interest in acting. Hudson was there because his college roommate had convinced him to try something new. They'd ended up in the same volunteer group, painting sets. And Sarah's quick wit and engineering precision had captivated him completely. She was everything his parents' careful planning hadn't accounted for. Spontaneous, brilliant in unexpected ways, unimpressed by conventional markers of success. Sarah worked as a civil engineer for the city's water department, a job she loved despite its modest pay because it meant something. She talked about infrastructure with the passion most people reserved for art or music, explaining how clean water and safe bridges literally held society together. Hudson's parents had been politely horrified when he announced his engagement to the engineer girl after only 8 months. They worried about her student loans, her lack of family wealth, her very practical approach to a wedding that cost less than Sarah's used car. But Hudson had never been more certain of anything. Sarah saw him, really saw him, beyond the corporate ambitions he'd never truly wanted. Bailey arrived 2 years later, planned and welcomed. Hudson remembered Sarah in the delivery room, exhausted and triumphant, declaring their daughter would be Bailey Lynn Vaughn, keeping both their names because she deserves her full heritage. His parents had disapproved of the hyphenation too, adding it to their growing list of concerns about Hudson's choices. Those early years had been the happiest of Hudson's life. Sarah advanced to senior engineer, managing major infrastructure projects. Hudson discovered he actually enjoyed the insurance work when it involved helping families secure their futures. They bought a small house in Thorndale, a working-class neighborhood with good schools and neighbors who actually talked to each other. Life felt solidly, satisfyingly normal. Bailey turned 8 the same week Sarah started complaining about fatigue. At first, they blamed stress from a major bridge renovation project. Then Sarah began bruising easily, developing persistent infections. By the time she saw a doctor, the leukemia was advanced, aggressive, and merciless. Hudson still remembered the oncologist's careful explanation. The statistics that meant nothing in the face of watching your wife grow weaker daily. Sarah approached her illness with characteristic practicality, researching treatments, organizing their finances, making lists of things Bailey would need to know as she grew up. She fought for 18 months, enduring chemotherapy that ravaged her body while never quite killing the cancer. Near the end, Sarah made Hudson promise 2 things. First, to make sure Bailey understood that weakness wasn't failure, that asking for help was strength. Second, to not let grief make him small, to stay open to life even when it felt safer to shut down. Hudson had tried to keep those promises in the 3 years since Sarah died. Some days were easier than others. The insurance company had been understanding initially, offering bereavement leave and flexible scheduling. But as months passed and Hudson's focus remained fractured, his performance reviews declined. The suggestion that he might be happier elsewhere had been phrased delicately, but the message was clear. They'd given him a decent severance package, which was something his parents had offered to help, on the condition that he and Bailey move back to Brookhaven, where they could provide proper stability. The unspoken criticism was clear. Hudson's choices had led to this difficulty, and returning to their world was the solution. He declined, determined to build a life on his own terms, even if those terms were harder. The bakery job had been almost accidental. A former college friend worked there, mentioned they needed someone reliable for early morning shifts. Hudson had started as a favor, expecting to find something better within weeks. 3 years later, he was still there, and it had become more than just a paycheck. There was something deeply satisfying about baking, about the precise chemistry that transformed flour, water, and yeast into nourishment. Unlike insurance paperwork or corporate politics, bread was honest. If you followed the process correctly, you got good results. If you cut corners or rushed, the bread told you immediately. Hudson appreciated that directness. The work was physically demanding, starting at 4 a.m. when most of Ashmont City still slept. His hands, once soft from office work, had developed calluses from kneading dough and hefting flour sacks. His back ached after long shifts. But there was dignity in the labor, a satisfaction his insurance job had never provided. His coworkers at Greenfield Commercial Bakery were mostly immigrants, people who'd fled difficult circumstances and rebuilt lives through sheer determination. They'd accepted Hudson without judgment, teaching him shortcuts and techniques, never asking why a guy with a college degree was working a job that didn't require one. When Bailey's birthday came around, they'd pooled money for a cake decorated with elaborate sugarwork that must have taken hours. Money was perpetually tight. Sarah's medical bills had consumed their savings despite decent insurance. The mortgage on their Thorndale house stretched his budget, even with the bakery job paying better than he'd expected. Bailey needed things constantly: new shoes, school supplies, the occasional treat that made her feel normal among wealthier classmates. Hudson had sold Sarah's car, downgraded his own to an older model that required constant maintenance, learned to cook cheap meals that Bailey would actually eat. He'd become an expert at thrift store shopping, finding barely worn clothes and surprisingly good books. Pride had been an early casualty of widowhood. The hardest part wasn't the money, though. It was the loneliness. Not just missing Sarah, though he did, constantly, but missing adult conversation, intellectual connection, the sense of partnership that made daily struggles feel manageable. His friends from the insurance days had drifted away, uncomfortable with his reduced circumstances. The bakery co-workers were kind, but their lives were vastly different from his. Dating felt impossible. Who wanted a widowed baker with a preteen daughter in crushing debt? Even if someone did, how could he risk Bailey's emotional stability on something that might not work out? She'd lost her mother. He couldn't let her get attached to someone who might leave. So Hudson had settled into a routine of work, parenting, and solitude. He read library books during Bailey's activities. He watched documentaries late at night when sleep wouldn't come. He told himself he was content, that this was enough. Then a dying woman had called his number by mistake, and something in her desperate request had cracked open feelings Hudson had sealed away. The desire to matter to someone beyond Bailey's father or a reliable baker. The need to be seen as more than his circumstances suggested. Alana didn't know about his dead wife, his failed corporate career, his financial struggles. She knew only that he made bread and answered calls at 3 a.m. with unexpected kindness. Somehow, that limited knowledge felt like seeing him more clearly than people who'd known him for years. Alana Reeves had been born into wealth so vast it became invisible, like air or gravity. The Reeves pharmaceutical empire stretched across 4 continents, its medications prescribed in hospitals from Singapore to Stockholm. Her grandfather had founded the company in 1952 with a single breakthrough antibiotic. Her father, Harrison Reeves, had expanded it into a multinational giant worth billions. She'd grown up in estates, not homes. The primary residence in Ashmont City occupied an entire block in the historic Belridge district, with 17 bedrooms, an indoor pool, and staff quarters larger than most people's houses. There were vacation properties in Santorini, Aspen, and the French Riviera. Private jets, yacht charters, security details that materialized whenever she left the house. To the outside world, Alana's life looked like a fairy tale. Magazine profiles called her the Princess of Pharmaceuticals, photographing her at charity galas in couture gowns, at exclusive parties with celebrities and politicians. She'd attended prestigious private schools, graduated from Stanford with honors in biochemistry, traveled to places most people only saw in documentaries, but fairy tales rarely mentioned the cost of privilege. Alana's mother, Catherine, had died when Alana was 7, a brain aneurysm that struck without warning during a company retreat in the Hamptons. Harrison had remarried within 2 years to Kendall Myers, a corporate attorney 20 years his junior. Beautiful and ambitious and utterly uninterested in stepchildren, Alana had learned early that her father's love was conditional, measured in achievements and public image. Straight A's were expected, not celebrated. Her piano performances at school recitals went unattended because board meetings took precedence. When she'd expressed interest in medical research rather than business management, Harrison's disappointment had been palpable. The company needs leadership, not laboratory work, he'd told her during her sophomore year at Stanford. Your degree in biochemistry is fine for understanding our products, but your future is in the boardroom, not a research facility. She'd complied, as she always did, joining Reeves Pharmaceutical after graduation in a junior executive position that everyone knew was nepotism. Her co-workers treated her with careful politeness, never quite trusting whether her ideas were her own or directives from Harrison. Her suggestions in meetings were received with the kind of enthusiastic agreement that meant nothing would actually change. The work itself felt hollow. Reeves Pharmaceutical's mission statements spoke of improving lives and advancing healthcare, but boardroom discussions focused on profit margins, patent protections, and maximizing shareholder value. When generic competitors threatened their most profitable medications, the legal team found ways to extend patents, keeping prices high even as patients struggled to afford treatments. Alana had tried to voice concerns about pricing strategies that put life-saving medications out of reach for average families. Harrison had shut her down with public patience and private fury. You don't understand business realities, he'd told her coldly. We have shareholders to answer to, research costs to recoup. Your idealism is admirable, but impractical. She'd felt increasingly trapped, a decorative piece in her father's empire, valued for her appearance at company events, but dismissed when she tried to contribute meaningfully. The charitable foundation bearing her mother's name had become her escape, a place where she could actually make decisions, fund research into rare diseases, support community health initiatives. Through the foundation, Alana discovered what genuine purpose felt like. She visited clinics serving underserved communities, met researchers working on treatments for diseases affecting small populations that pharmaceutical companies ignored because the profit potential was too limited. She funded scholarships for aspiring doctors from low-income backgrounds, supported mental health initiatives, partnered with organizations working on healthcare access. That it was through this foundation work that she'd first heard whispers about Thorndale, a working-class neighborhood in Ashmont City's industrial zone where cancer rates were inexplicably high. Local activists claimed the water supply was contaminated, pointing to elevated levels of industrial chemicals. They'd filed complaints with environmental agencies, demanded investigations, ACCUSED nearby manufacturing facilities of illegal dumping. Reeves Pharmaceutical owned one of those facilities, a production plant that manufactured several of their most profitable medications, employing nearly 300 local workers. When Alana asked her father about the Thorndale situation, his response had been swift and dismissive. Ambulance-chasing lawyers trying to blame legitimate business for natural illness patterns. Our facility has passed every environmental inspection. The claims are baseless. But Alana had learned to recognize when her father was hiding something. She'd seen that particular expression before, the careful neutrality that meant he was protecting information he didn't want examined too closely. So she'd started her own quiet investigation through the foundation, funding an independent environmental study of Thorndale's water supply. The results had been damning. Industrial chemicals at levels far exceeding safe limits. Compounds that match the specific byproducts of pharmaceutical manufacturing processes. A clear contamination pattern radiating from the area surrounding Reeves' Thorndale facility. The study had been completed 6 months ago. Sitting in Alana's private files while she debated what to do with information that could destroy her father's company and legacy. Then she'd received her cancer diagnosis. Stage 4 lymphoma, aggressive and advanced. The oncologist had been cautiously optimistic initially, talking about treatment protocols and survival statistics. But the cancer had proven resistant to standard chemotherapy, progressing despite increasingly harsh treatments that left her weak and nauseated. 3 months ago, her medical team had gently suggested she consider end-of-life planning. Weeks, they said. Maybe a month or 2 with luck. She should put her affairs in order, make peace with family, enjoy whatever time remained. Alana had done none of those things. Instead, she'd become obsessed with the Thorndale evidence, reading through medical records of cancer patients in that neighborhood, comparing their illness patterns to her own. The similarities were striking. Many had the same aggressive lymphomas, the same resistance to standard treatments, the same rapid progression. She'd confronted Harrison 2 weeks ago in his office, demanding the truth about Thorndale. His face had gone carefully blank. The expression he wore when dealing with hostile shareholders or investigative journalists. "Those allegations have been thoroughly investigated and dismissed," he'd said, each word precise and cold. "I'm disappointed that you would give credence to conspiracy theories, especially now when you should be focusing on your health." "People are dying," Alana had replied, her voice shaking. "Including me. I want to know if the company is responsible." Harrison had stood, moving to the window overlooking Ashmont City, his back to her. "You're upset, which is understandable given your diagnosis. But you're not thinking clearly. Reeves Pharmaceutical employs thousands of people, provides essential medications to millions. Whatever you think you've discovered, consider the larger implications before making accusations you can't prove." The conversation had ended there. Alana had left his office knowing she'd lost whatever fragile connection they'd maintained. In the weeks since, Harrison had been overseas more often than not, attending conferences and merger discussions. Kendall made excuses about busy schedules when Alana called. The isolation had been absolute. She'd withdrawn to her penthouse, the sterile, beautiful space purchased with family money, decorated by designers who'd never asked what she actually liked. The view was spectacular. The loneliness was crushing. Every surface reminded her of wealth that had bought everything except what mattered. Genuine connection, purpose beyond profit. Someone who cared whether she lived or died. The evidence about Thorndale contamination sat in her secure files, still undisclosed. She had the power to expose the truth, to force accountability, to perhaps prevent other families from suffering as hers had. But doing so would destroy her father's company, cost thousands of jobs, demolish a legacy 3 generations in the making. And for what? She was dying anyway. Would exposing the contamination change anything? Would it bring justice to victims or just create more suffering? Alana had wrestled with these questions through endless sleepless nights, finding no clear answers until she'd accidentally called Hudson Vaughn at 2:47 a.m. and found herself speaking to someone who knew nothing about her wealth or family or the impossible choices weighing on her. Someone who'd simply stayed on the line because she'd asked, who'd talked to her about bread and normal days and reminded her what it felt like to be seen as just a person. The phone calls became a ritual, neither acknowledged but both anticipated. Every night around 9, after Bailey was in bed and Hudson had finished his evening chores, his phone would ring. They'd talk for hours, conversations meandering through topics both profound and trivial. Alana told Hudson about the book she was reading, complex literary fiction she'd never had time for during her corporate years. Hudson described the satisfaction of perfecting sourdough starter, the living culture that required patience and attention. She asked detailed questions about baking chemistry. He wanted to know about the classical music she loved. Admitting his knowledge didn't extend much beyond recognizing famous composers. "You should listen to Chopin's Nocturnes," Alana suggested during one call. "Especially Opus 9, No. 2. It's beautiful without being overwhelming." Hudson had downloaded the piece, listening while he prepped ingredients for the next day's shift. She was right. The piano melody carried a melancholy beauty that somehow fit the pre-dawn darkness of his kitchen. He told her so during their next conversation. You listen, Alana said, genuine pleasure in her voice. Most people say they will and never do. Why wouldn't I? Hudson replied. You recommended it. That means something. The simplicity of his response seemed to catch her off guard. After a pause, she said quietly, It does mean something. Thank you for making it matter. Their conversations ventured into more personal territory as weeks passed. Hudson found himself describing his marriage to Sarah, how she'd challenged his assumptions about success and meaning. Alana listened without the awkward sympathy most people offered when he mentioned his late wife. Asking thoughtful questions that showed she understood grief wasn't a problem to be solved, but a reality to be lived with. She sounds like she knew exactly who she was, Alana observed. That's rarer than people think. She did, Hudson agreed. I'm still figuring out who I am without her. Maybe that's the point, Alana said. Not to be who you were with her, but to become who you are because of having known her. The insight struck Hudson as profound, something he'd been circling around for 3 years without quite articulating. Is that what you're doing? He asked. Becoming who you are because of what you've experienced. A long silence followed. Finally, Alana spoke, her voice careful. I'm trying to figure out who I am separate from what I was supposed to be. It's harder than it sounds. She began sharing more about her isolated childhood, the pressure of expectation she'd never questioned until recently. She never mentioned her family name or the specific nature of her father's business, maintaining the anonymity that allowed her to speak freely. But Hudson picked up pieces: wealth, corporate pressure, a father more interested in legacy than relationship. Do you think it's possible to do the right thing for complicated reasons? Alana asked one night, the question seeming to come from some internal debate Hudson couldn't see. What do you mean? Like if you wanted to expose wrongdoing, but part of your motivation was anger at someone involved. Does that make the action less right? Hudson considered carefully. I think most right actions have mixed motivations. We're human, not saints. The question is whether the action itself is just regardless of why you're taking it. But what if doing the right thing hurts innocent people? People who depend on the system you're exposing. Then it's complicated, Hudson admitted. But letting injustice continue to protect a flawed system doesn't seem right either. Sometimes there are no clean choices, just less bad ones. Alana was quiet for so long Hudson thought the call had dropped. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. Thank you. I needed to hear that. Hudson wanted to ask what she was dealing with, what decision weighed so heavily. But he respected the boundaries she'd established, trusting she'd share when ready. Bailey knew about the calls, though Hudson had been vague about details. Just a friend going through a hard time, he'd explained. His daughter had accepted this with surprising maturity, sometimes reminding him when 9 o'clock approached that his friend would be calling soon. One evening, Bailey had asked, Is your friend the one who's sick? The one from that first night? Hudson had forgotten Bailey had heard that initial conversation, her room adjacent to his with walls too thin for real privacy. Yes, he'd admitted. She's very ill. Bailey had nodded solemnly. That's good you talked to her then. Mom always said being there matters more than fixing things. The simple wisdom had made Hudson's throat tight. Sarah had indeed believed that, had practiced it in how she approached her own illness, and how she'd wanted others to treat her. Not as a problem to solve, but as a person to accompany through difficulty. 3 weeks into their nightly conversations, Alana mentioned she'd been reading about Thorndale, the neighborhood where Hudson lived. Her tone was carefully casual, but something in it made Hudson's attention sharpen. What made you interested in Thorndale? He asked. Just an article I came across about community health initiatives, Alana said, still casual. It mentioned elevated cancer rates. Is that true? Hudson felt his jaw tighten. Very true. My wife was one of the statistics. A lot of our neighbors have gotten sick, mostly cancers. The community has been trying to prove its environmental contamination. But the companies responsible have expensive lawyers. I'm sorry, Alana said. And Hudson heard genuine emotion beneath the words. That must be incredibly frustrating. It is, watching people suffer while corporations hide behind legal protections and claim their facilities are perfectly safe. Sarah died believing the system would eventually work, that truth would win out. I'm not that optimistic anymore. The conversation had moved to other topics, but Hudson noticed Alana seemed distracted for the rest of the call, responding a beat too slowly, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. Over the following days, their talks continued to deepen. Alana began, speaking about legacy, about wanting her life to have meant something beyond wealth and social position. Hudson shared his fears about Bailey growing up, about whether he was giving her what she needed, about the constant worry that he was failing as a father. You're not failing, Alana insisted during one of these conversations. Bailey is thoughtful, kind, curious about the world. Those qualities don't happen accidentally. You're doing something right. How do you know? Hudson asked. You've never met her. I know because of how you talk about her. The pride and worry and love in your voice. That matters more than perfect circumstances. Hudson found himself looking forward to their calls with an intensity that surprised him. This connection with someone he'd never met felt more substantial than relationships with people he saw regularly. Alana understood his struggles without judgment, shared her own vulnerabilities, made him feel seen in ways he hadn't experienced since Sarah died. He began sharing details about his day specifically to tell her, noticing small moments he knew she'd appreciate. A perfectly risen loaf, Bailey's excitement over a science grade, the way morning light hit his kitchen window. Alana reciprocated, describing the view from her apartment, books she thought he'd enjoy, memories from before her illness. Neither acknowledged what was becoming increasingly obvious. They were becoming important to each other in ways that transcended their original connection. The late-night phone calls had evolved into something neither had planned, but both needed desperately. Until the night Hudson made a casual comment that changed everything. There's a protest planned for this weekend, Hudson mentioned during their call, his tone frustrated. Local activists are targeting Reeves Pharmaceuticals' Thorndale facility. They've got evidence of contamination, but nobody with real power seems to care. The silence on Alana's end stretched so long Hudson checked to see if the call had dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice had gone cold and distant. Reeves Pharmaceutical. That's the company you mentioned? Yeah, the main one everyone suspects of contaminating our water supply. They've been dodging accountability for years, hiding behind their lawyers and political connections. The Reeves family basically owns half the politicians in Ashmont. Hudson's anger leaked into his words, built up from years of watching neighbors suffer. Rich people who don't care how many working-class families get sick as long as their profits stay high. Another long pause. Hudson, what's your last name? The question seemed to come from nowhere, but something in Alana's tone made his stomach drop. Vaughn, why? And you live in Thorndale. Your wife Sarah died from cancer you believe was caused by contaminated water near the Reeves facility. It wasn't a question. Hudson felt ice spreading through his chest. How do you know Sarah's name? I never told you her name. Hudson Vaughn, Alana said slowly, as though testing the words. There was a news article about Thorndale cancer victims last year. A widowed father raising his daughter alone, a maintenance worker turned baker, amateur researcher documenting contamination patterns. That's you, isn't it? Hudson's mind raced. Yes, I wrote a research paper about the contamination as part of my degree work. But I still don't understand how you know my full name or about the article. Who are you? The silence that followed felt like falling. When Alana spoke again, her voice carried a tremor that could have been fear or anger or both. My name is Alana Reeves. The words hit Hudson like physical blows. Reeves, the family name behind the company he'd spent 3 years fighting, Corporation responsible for Sarah's death. The pharmaceutical empire that valued profit over human life. He stood abruptly, pacing his small living room, phone pressed to his ear. "You're Harrison Reeves' daughter," he said flatly. "The heiress to Reeves Pharmaceutical." Yes. A dozen conversations replayed in Hudson's mind with sickening new context. Her careful questions about Thorndale, her interest in his wife's illness, the way she'd steered him to talk about the contamination. The accidental phone call suddenly felt anything but accidental. "Did you know who I was when you called?" His voice came out harsh, controlled fury barely contained. Was this whole thing some kind of corporate intelligence gathering? Get close to the activist. Find out what evidence we have. "No," Alana said quickly. "Hudson, I swear I had no idea who you were until tonight. The first call really was an accident. But you figured it out at some point. When? How long have you known?" "I didn't know anything until you mentioned Thorndale and Sarah. Then I looked you up because the connection seemed too coincidental. But I swear the first call was random. Everything we've talked about was real." Hudson wanted to believe her, but betrayal burned too hot for rational thought. "Everything was real? You're the daughter of the man whose company killed my wife. You have access to all of Reeves' internal data, all the proof of contamination they're hiding, and you've done nothing. You've just sat in your penthouse talking to me while people in my neighborhood continue getting sick." "It's not that simple," Alana protested, emotion breaking through her composure. "I've been trying to figure out what to do, how to handle the evidence without destroying thousands of jobs and people who depend on the company." "Oh, I'm sorry," Hudson shot back, sarcasm sharp as broken glass. "I didn't realize exposing corporate manslaughter was complicated for you. Tell me, does your moral struggle help the families burying loved ones? Does it give them their health back? You think I don't know people are suffering?" Alana's voice rose, matching his anger. "I'm dying from the same lymphoma pattern as Thorndale victims. I suspect my own family's company might be responsible for my cancer. So yes, Hudson, I understand suffering pretty intimately." The revelation should have softened Hudson's fury. Instead, it sharpened. "Then why haven't you done anything? You have evidence, you have resources, you have a name that carries weight. You could force accountability. But instead, you've been playing phone confidant with me while sitting on information that could save lives." "I was going to," Alana said, her voice cracking. "I've been planning to release everything, to testify against my own father's company. But I needed time to figure out how to make sure I did it right. Then you mentioned the protest and Reeves. And I realized you're one of the activists I'd been researching, and suddenly everything felt like a setup." "A setup?" Hudson laughed bitterly. "You think I engineered this? That I somehow manipulated a dying heiress into calling my random phone number at 3 a.m? "I don't know what to think," Alana admitted, exhaustion replacing anger in her voice. "The timing is too perfect. You're researching Reeves' contamination, fighting for justice for Thorndale, and suddenly I accidentally call you? Start sharing my family secrets and evidence with exactly the person who could use it against the company." Understanding dawned cold and clear. "You think I targeted you? That these weeks of conversation were me manipulating you for information, weren't they?" Alana asked quietly. "How do I know what was real and what was strategic? You have every reason to want revenge against my family. Befriending the dying daughter would be an effective way to get insider information." Hudson felt something breaking inside his chest, something fragile that had been rebuilding after Sarah's death. "I listened to you at 3 a.m. because you sounded terrified and alone. I talked to you every night because you made me feel less isolated. I shared things about Sarah I haven't told anyone because you actually understood grief. That was real, Alana, all of it. How can I know that?" Her voice was small, lost. "You can't," Hudson said after a long moment, anger draining into something worse, resignation. "Just like I can't know if you accidentally called me or if this was some guilt-driven attempt to ease your conscience. By befriending one of your father's victims. I guess we're both stuck wondering. Hudson, please, Alana began, but he cut her off. I need to go. Bailey has school tomorrow, and I have an early shift. Wait, can we talk about this? Figure it out. Hudson looked around his small apartment. At the life he'd built from wreckage, at the phone that had briefly connected him to something that felt like hope. I don't think there's anything to figure out. You're Harrison Reeves' daughter. I'm the man whose wife your family's company killed. That's the reality. Everything else was just fantasy we told ourselves at 3 a.m. It was more than that, Alana insisted, desperation clear now. Maybe it was. Or maybe we both needed something and convinced ourselves this accidental connection meant something it didn't. Either way, I can't do this anymore. He ended the call before she could respond, then stood in his silent living room. Phone still in his hand, trying to reconcile the woman he'd come to care about with the heiress whose family legacy was built on suffering. His phone rang again immediately. Alana's number. Hudson declined the call, then another, then a third. Finally, he turned off his phone entirely, sitting in darkness while trying to unknow everything he'd learned. 3 days passed in silence. Hudson threw himself into work, accepting extra shifts at the bakery, volunteering for the jobs nobody wanted. Anything to keep his mind occupied, to exhaust himself so thoroughly that sleep came before thoughts of Alana could intrude. It didn't work. Every night around 9, he'd catch himself glancing at his phone, expecting it to ring. The silence felt heavier than it should, a presence rather than an absence. He'd grown accustomed to those conversations, had reorganized his evenings around them. Now the hours stretched empty and accusing. Bailey noticed, of course. She was too perceptive not to see the change in her father. The way he moved through their apartment like a ghost. Present but not really there. Your friend stopped calling, she observed at breakfast on the 4th day. Her tone carefully neutral in the way she'd learned meant she was worried, but trying not to show it. We're not talking anymore, Hudson said. Focusing intently on his coffee, did you have a fight? Hudson considered how to answer. How could he explain that his friend was actually the daughter of the company responsible for Sarah's death? That their connection had been built on lies or at least on carefully maintained ignorance? It's complicated, Bailbug. Sometimes people have histories that make friendship impossible. Bailey absorbed this with her characteristic seriousness. Mom used to say that nothing good was ever simple. That the complicated things were usually worth the effort. The observation hit harder than it should have. Sarah had said exactly that, usually when Hudson wanted to take the easy path, to avoid difficult conversations or challenging situations. She'd pushed him to engage with complexity rather than retreat into comfortable simplicity. Mom was talking about different kinds of complicated, Hudson said. Though even as he spoke, he wasn't entirely sure that was true. That evening, Bailey emerged from her room carrying a sheet of paper. The careful printing and decorated borders suggesting she'd spent considerable time on it. She set it on the kitchen table without a word, then returned to her homework. Leaving Hudson to read alone, the letter was addressed to Hudson's friend. In Bailey's neat handwriting, Dear Hudson's friend. I don't know your name or why you and my dad stopped talking, but I wanted to write to you anyway. My dad has been sad since you stopped calling. He tries to hide it, but I can tell. He gets quiet and stares at his phone at night when he thinks I'm asleep. Before you started calling, Dad was lonely even when we were together. I could feel it. But when you called, he smiled more. He played music I'd never heard him play before. He seemed less heavy, like something that had been pressing on him got lighter. I know grown-up problems are complicated. Mom used to tell me that before she died. She said sometimes people hurt each other, even when they don't mean to. And that figuring out how to be friends again after hurt is one of the hardest things humans have to do. But she also said that the hardest things are usually the most important things. That easy relationships don't teach you anything, but hard ones teach you everything about who you really are. Don't know what happened between you and Dad. Maybe it's too broken to fix. But I thought you should know that whatever time you had talking to him mattered. He's a good person who misses you. And if you miss him too, maybe that's worth something. Thank you for making my dad less lonely. Even if it was just for a little while. Bailey Hudson read the letter 3 times. Throat tight with emotion he couldn't quite name. His daughter's insight cut through all his anger and hurt. Exposing the simple truth beneath. He missed Alana. Not the abstract heiress, not Harrison Reeves' daughter, but the woman who'd asked him to stay on the line at 3 a.m. because she didn't want to die alone. That night, he lay awake staring at his dark ceiling, Bailey's words circling through his mind. Was he being fair? Alana had never claimed to be anyone other than who she was. She'd maintained privacy, yes, but so had he. He'd never mentioned his research into Reeves' contamination. Never told her he was one of the community activists fighting her family's company. If she'd been manipulating him, what had she gained? They'd talked about music, books, grief, parenting, the small moments that made up ordinary life. She hadn't pumped him for information about activist strategies or community evidence. She just listened, shared, connected, and when he'd mentioned Thorndale and Reeves, she hadn't hidden her identity. She could have continued the deception, could have kept him ignorant while gathering whatever information she wanted. Instead, she'd revealed herself, asked direct questions. Been honest about her connection even knowing it, would likely end whatever they'd built. Hudson thought about her voice when she'd said she was planning to release evidence against her own father's company. The exhaustion and fear and determination in those words. She'd been wrestling with an impossible decision. Expose the truth and destroy her family legacy, or protect the company and let injustice continue. He'd judged her harshly for hesitating. But would he have done differently in her position? If exposing the truth meant destroying Bailey's future, costing thousands of jobs, taking down an institution 3 generations had built, could he do it without hesitation? The answer, Hudson admitted to himself in the darkness, was that he didn't know. It was easy to demand justice when you weren't the one who had to pull the trigger. Harder when the consequences would reshape your entire world. Meanwhile, in her penthouse 42 floors above Ashmont City, Alana sat surrounded by documents she'd been organizing for weeks. Evidence of contamination, internal emails proving knowledge of health risks, falsified environmental reports. Everything needed to prove Reeves Pharmaceuticals' negligence in Thorndale, and potentially other communities. She'd made her decision 3 days ago, in the awful silence after Hudson hung up. If she was going to die, she would do it having done one meaningful thing, regardless of the cost. Tomorrow she would deliver this evidence to the State Attorney General, to environmental agencies, to the media. The Reeves empire would face consequences. People like Hudson would finally get justice for their losses, but the victory felt hollow without anyone to share it with. She'd tried calling Hudson 17 times over 3 days before accepting that he wasn't going to answer. His rejection hurt more than her father's indifference, more than Kendall's abandonment, more than the cancer eating away at her body, because Hudson had seen her, really seen her, without the weight of her family name or the armor of her corporate identity. And she'd lost that connection through circumstance beyond anyone's control. Through the cosmic joke of accidentally calling the one person in Ashmont City whose life her family had destroyed. A soft knock on her penthouse door startled Alana from her thoughts. It was past 11, too late for the concierge or building staff. She considered ignoring it, but the knock came again. Tentative but persistent, through the peephole. She saw a young girl, maybe 12, with dark hair and serious eyes, holding an envelope. Bailey, Hudson's daughter. Alana recognized her from the news article photo. Though the girl had grown since then, Alana opened the door, confusion and hope warring in her chest. "Bailey?" "You're Alana," Bailey said, not a question. "I found your address from Dad's phone when he was in the shower. He doesn't know I'm here. Does he know you left the apartment? Alana asked, concerned. He thinks I'm at Emma's house studying. Her mom covers for me sometimes. Bailey held out the envelope. I wrote you a letter, but I needed to give it to you in person because I needed to see if you were real. Alana took the letter, her hands trembling slightly. Real? Dad's been sad since you stopped talking. I needed to know if you were sad too, or if you were just using him. Bailey's directness was startling, uncomfortably perceptive. Mom said you could always tell if someone was good by looking in their eyes when they thought no one was watching. Alana felt tears threatening, pushed them back. I'm very sad, she admitted. Your father is an extraordinary person. Talking to him these past weeks has been the best part of dying. Bailey studied her for a long moment, then nodded as though something had been confirmed. You're telling the truth. I can tell. She turned to leave, then paused. He misses you too, even though he's angry. He just doesn't know how to be both at the same time. After Bailey left, Alana opened a letter, reading the careful words about loneliness and connection. About her father's smile returning during their calls, about hard things being important things. The letter ended with a postscript that made Alana's breath. See ya TCHPS. Whatever you're planning to do about the bad thing your family's company did, I hope you do it. Not for my dad or for revenge or anything like that. But because Mom always said the hardest part of being brave isn't facing danger. It's choosing truth when lying would be easier. I think you're brave. I hope you think so too. The press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. at the State Attorney General's office. Alana had coordinated with environmental prosecutors, provided them with copies of all her evidence, agreed to testify despite knowing it would likely be one of her last public acts. Her medical team had been clear. She had days, maybe a week if her body continued cooperating. The press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. at the State Attorney General's office. Alana had coordinated with environmental prosecutors, provided them with copies of all her evidence, agreed to testify despite knowing it would likely be one of her last public acts. Her medical team had been clear. She had days, maybe a week if her body continued cooperating. She dressed carefully that morning, wanting to look strong despite her frailty. The tailored suit hung loose on her diminished frame, but her spine was straight, her voice steady as she reviewed her statement one final time. Harrison had called 12 times since learning about the press conference. She'd ignored every call. The Attorney General's conference room was packed with reporters, environmental advocates, and community representatives from Thorndale. Alana recognized several faces from the news articles she'd studied. People who'd been fighting for years to prove what her family had hidden. They watched her with expressions ranging from hope to suspicion. Wondering if the heiress's change of heart was genuine or calculated. She stood at the podium. Cameras flashing, recording devices thrust forward. Behind the press corps, near the back of the room, she spotted a tall figure she'd recognize anywhere despite having never seen him in person. Hudson stood against the wall, arms crossed, his expression carefully neutral. He didn't wave or acknowledge her beyond his presence. But he was there, bearing witness. Alana gripped the podium, drawing strength from his unexpected attendance. She began speaking, her voice carrying despite her physical weakness. My name is Alana Reeves. I'm the daughter of Harrison Reeves, CEO of Reeves Pharmaceutical. And I'm here to provide evidence that my family's company has knowingly contaminated the water supply in the Thorndale neighborhood of Ashmont City, resulting in elevated cancer rates that have killed dozens and sickened hundreds more. The room erupted with questions shouted over each other. Alana raised a hand for silence and continued. For the past 6 months, I've been gathering internal company documents, environmental reports, and communications between Reeves executives that prove they were aware of contamination from our Thorndale manufacturing facility. Not only were they aware, they actively worked to conceal this information. falsifying reports submitted to environmental agencies, and harassing families who attempted to file lawsuits. She methodically presented her evidence, displaying emails on the screen behind her, communications discussing acceptable casualty rates in surrounding communities, cost-benefit analyses weighing lawsuit settlements against the expense of proper waste disposal, instructions to legal teams on discrediting sick families as opportunists seeking undeserved compensation. These documents show that Reeves Pharmaceutical chose profit over human life, Alana said, her voice gaining strength. They show a pattern of deliberate negligence that continued for over a decade, even as cancer rates in Thorndale climbed to 3 times the national average. She paused, gathering courage for what came next. I know this because I've spent months researching every family affected by this contamination. I've read medical records, death certificates, testimonies from people who lost loved ones, while my family's lawyers fought to deny responsibility. Her eyes found Hudson again in the back of the room. He was watching her intently now, some of the hardness in his expression softening. One of those families was the Vaughn family. Sarah Lynn Vaughn died 3 years ago from an aggressive lymphoma, consistent with the cancer pattern seen throughout Thorndale. She left behind a husband and a young daughter. Her death was not random. It was not unavoidable. It was the direct result of corporate decisions that prioritized profit margins over environmental safety. Alana's voice wavered but didn't break. I'm dying from the same type of lymphoma. My doctors initially assumed it was genetic, just bad luck. But after studying the Thorndale contamination patterns, I believe my cancer may also be connected to exposure at the facility. I've visited that plant dozens of times over the years, touring the production floors, meeting with workers. If the contamination was severe enough to poison the surrounding neighborhood's water supply, it was certainly affecting people inside the facility. She let that revelation settle before continuing. I'm not sharing this for sympathy. I'm sharing it because it illustrates a fundamental truth. Pollution doesn't care about wealth or family legacy or corporate position. It affects everyone in its path. The difference is that people like me have resources to fight back. Families in Thorndale didn't. The questions came in a flood after that. Why had she waited to come forward? What did her father know? Would she testify in criminal proceedings? Alana answered what she could, deflecting questions about Harrison with cold professionalism. My father's knowledge and involvement will be determined by the ongoing investigation. I'm providing everything I have access to. The rest is for prosecutors to uncover. After 40 minutes, her energy was clearly flagging. The Attorney General stepped in, thanking Alana and announcing that formal charges would be filed within the week. As security escorted her through the crowd of reporters still shouting questions, Alana searched for Hudson. He was gone, outside the building. Alana leaned against the car that would take her back to the penthouse, exhausted but relieved. She'd done it. The truth was out. Whatever happened now, she'd chosen justice over loyalty, transparency over protection of her family legacy. Her phone buzzed with an incoming message from an unknown number. She opened it, hope flaring despite her exhaustion. You were brave today. Bailey was right about you. Alana's vision blurred with tears. She responded quickly, fingers shaking. You were there. I almost wasn't. But I needed to see it for myself. To understand, and do you? Understand? A long pause before his response came. I understand it wasn't easy. That you chose truth even when it cost you everything. That takes courage I'm not sure I could have managed. Alana slid down to sit on the curb, unconcerned with her expensive suit or the curious glances from passers-by. I should have done it sooner. Before we talked. Before I knew your name. I let fear and loyalty paralyze me when people were suffering. You did it when you could. That matters not. Does it change anything? Between us? The wait for his response felt eternal. When it came, the words were careful, measured. I don't know yet. But I'm trying to understand instead of just being angry. That's something. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was more than the silence of the past 3 days, more than the anger that had ended their last conversation. It was a door left open, not closed. That's enough, Alana typed back. Thank you for witnessing today. Thank you for doing it. Sarah would have appreciated knowing the truth finally came out. Alana watched the message thread, waiting to see if he would write more. When nothing came, she pocketed her phone and allowed the driver to help her into the car. Through the tinted window, she watched Ashmont City passing by, knowing it would be among her last trips through these streets. But she'd done something that mattered. She'd exposed the truth, forced accountability, given families like Hudson's the justice they'd been denied for years. The Reeves empire would crumble. Her father would face consequences. The pharmaceutical industry would have to answer for putting profit before human life. It should have felt triumphant. Instead, as Alana returned to her empty penthouse, she felt only the profound exhaustion of someone who'd spent everything they had on one necessary act. She'd stood alone against the darkness, exactly as Bailey had drawn in that letter weeks ago. But she'd stood. And Hudson had witnessed it. And somehow, despite everything, that was enough. 2 days after the press conference, Hudson found himself standing outside the Riverside Towers, the luxury residential building where Alana lived. Bailey's letter was folded in his pocket, its words about brave choices and truth over comfort having worked on him like water on stone. Gradually wearing down his anger until only understanding remained, the doorman eyed him with professional skepticism, taking in his work jacket and scuffed boots. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Alana Reeves." Penthouse level. Hudson expected to be turned away, but the doorman simply nodded and picked up a phone. "Name?" "Hudson Vaughn." A brief conversation followed, the doorman's expression shifting to something like surprise. He hung up and gestured to the elevator. "She says to send you up. Penthouse B, 42nd floor." The elevator was lined with mirrors and smelled of expensive air freshener. Hudson watched his reflection rise through the floors, wondering what he was doing here, what he would say. He'd rehearsed various approaches during the sleepless night, but none of them felt adequate to the complexity of what lay between them. The elevator opened directly into a small, private lobby serving only 2 penthouse units. Alana's door was already open, and she stood in the doorway, visibly thinner than he'd imagined from the press conference footage, her skin nearly translucent. But her eyes, those eyes he'd never seen but somehow knew intimately from their voices, held the same intelligence and sadness he'd come to recognize in her tone. "You came," she said simply. "I came," Hudson agreed. They stood looking at each other, bridging the gap between voices on a phone and physical presence. She was shorter than he'd pictured, more fragile, but there was steel beneath the illness that he recognized. "Would you like to come in?" Alana stepped back, gesturing to the penthouse beyond. "I promise not to bite, though I might need to sit down soon. Standing takes more energy than it used to." Hudson followed her inside, taking in the space that had been the backdrop to all their conversations. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing Ashmont City in daylight, the view spectacular and somehow lonely. Minimalist furniture that looked expensive but unlived in. Art on the walls that seemed chosen by designers rather than personal preference. Alana settled onto the sofa, gesturing for him to sit. He chose the chair across from her, maintaining distance while they navigated this unfamiliar territory. "I watched your press conference," Hudson said when the silence stretched. "Multiple times, actually. Bailey insisted on watching it with me." "She came to see me," Alana said. "A few nights ago. Found my address somehow and showed up to give me a letter she'd written." Hudson felt his stomach drop. "She what? Bailey came here alone at night?" "She's remarkably resourceful. Also remarkably perceptive." Alana smiled softly. "She wanted to make sure I was real, that I actually cared about you. She said she could tell if someone was good by looking in their eyes. That was something Sarah used to say, Hudson said, throat tight. Bailey remembers more than I sometimes realize. She's extraordinary. You should be very proud. I am. Hudson leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Alana, I came here because I owe you an apology. I judged you harshly for hesitating to expose your family's company. But the truth is, I don't know what I would have done in your position. It's easy to demand justice when it's not your family legacy you're destroying. Alana shook her head. You don't owe me an apology. You were right to be angry. I should have come forward sooner, should have put lives before loyalty. I let fear paralyze me. You came forward when you could. That took more courage than I gave you credit for. Hudson paused, choosing his next words carefully. The things we talked about these past weeks, were they real? Or were you trying to ease your guilt by befriending one of your father's victims? They were real, Alana said immediately. Hudson, I swear to you, that first call was genuinely an accident. I meant to call my night nurse and somehow dialed your number instead. Everything after that, every conversation, every moment we shared, was because talking to you made me feel human again. Even after you realized who I was. Especially after I realized who you were. Alana's voice grew thick with emotion. You had every reason to hate me, to blame me for your wife's death. But you talked to me about music and baking and normal days. You made me feel like more than a dying heiress or a pharmaceutical princess. You made me feel seen. Hudson felt his own emotions rising, the anger he'd been clinging to dissolving in the face of her raw honesty. I didn't know who you were either, remember? When I talked about Reeves Pharmaceutical destroying my community, I had no idea you were part of that family. Does it change how you feel about those conversations? Alana asked quietly. Knowing who I am? Hudson thought about it carefully. It complicates them. But it doesn't make them less real. You're not responsible for what your father's company did, any more than Bailey would be responsible if I did something terrible. You're your own person. I'm still a Reeves. That comes with responsibility. And you accepted that responsibility, Hudson pointed out. You exposed the truth despite knowing it would cost you everything. That's not the action of someone hiding behind family name. Alana wiped at her eyes, a gesture so human it broke Hudson's heart. I'm dying, Hudson. I have days, maybe a week according to my doctors. After tomorrow, I'll probably be too weak to leave this apartment. This is likely the only chance we'll have to talk in person. The reality of her mortality hit Hudson with unexpected force. He'd known abstractly that she was sick, but seeing her physical frailty made it undeniably real. Then I'm glad I came today. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the tension between them easing into something gentler. Finally, Alana spoke again. I've been thinking about what happens after I'm gone. The foundation my mother established, it's mine to direct now. I've been revising the mission statement, redirecting all assets toward supporting communities affected by corporate environmental negligence. She pulled out a folder from beside the sofa, handing it to Hudson. I want you to consider joining the board of directors. The foundation needs someone who understands these issues from a personal perspective. Someone who won't let corporate interests override community needs. Hudson opened the folder, scanning documents outlining the foundation's new direction, its substantial assets, and the proposed board structure. Alana, I'm a baker. I don't have experience with this kind of work. You have the most important qualification. You care more about people than profits. You can learn the rest. She leaned forward intently. Please consider it. Not for me, but for what it could accomplish. The foundation has resources that could help communities like Thorndale hold corporations accountable, fund health monitoring, support families dealing with contamination-related illness. Hudson set down the folder, meeting her eyes. I'll consider it. But I'd want Bailey's input. This would affect her too, of course. Alana smiled, genuine warmth breaking through her exhaustion. I'm also leaving instructions for the foundation to establish a scholarship in Sarah's name. For students from affected communities, pursuing environmental science or public health degrees. If that's okay with you. The gesture hit Hudson unexpectedly hard, tears threatening for the first time since entering the penthouse. Sarah would have loved that. Then it settled. Alana relaxed back into the sofa, clearly exhausted. Hudson, thank you for coming today. For giving me a chance to explain, to try to make things right. Hudson stood, recognizing she needed rest. At the door, he turned back. Alana, those conversations we had, they meant something to me too. You helped me feel less alone. That was real, regardless of everything else. Can I ask one more thing? Alana's voice was small, vulnerable in a way that reminded him of that first desperate call. Anything. Will you call me tonight? One more time like before. Hudson felt his heart break and mend simultaneously. Yes, I'll call at 9. Hudson called at exactly 9 o'clock that night, and every night after for the next 6 days. Their conversations had a different quality now, weighted with the knowledge that each might be the last. They talked about everything and nothing, sometimes in comfortable silence, sometimes in urgent exchanges as though trying to fit a lifetime of connection into borrowed time. Alana told him about her childhood, the loneliness of growing up with everything except what mattered. Hudson shared memories of Sarah that he'd kept locked away, finding that speaking them to Alana somehow honored both women. Bailey often joined the calls, her young voice bringing lightness to heavy moments, asking Alana about classical music and books, and what it was like to live so high above the city. It's lonely, Alana had answered honestly. Beautiful, but lonely. Like living in a jewelry box. Pretty to look at, but not meant for actual living. You should have gotten a dog, Bailey suggested with the practical wisdom of 12-year-olds. Dogs make everywhere feel less lonely. Alana had laughed, a sound that came less frequently as the days progressed. You're absolutely right. I should have gotten a dog. On the 7th night, the night nurse answered Hudson's call. Alana had slipped into unconsciousness that afternoon, her body finally surrendering to the cancer that had ravaged it for 18 months. She passed away peacefully at 4:23 a.m., alone except for the medical staff. In the penthouse that had been both sanctuary and prison, Hudson took Bailey to the memorial service. A surprisingly intimate affair given the Reeves family prominence. Harrison Reeves stood apart from most attendees, his grief private and complicated. Kendall was notably absent. The crowd consisted mainly of foundation staff, a few distant relatives, and surprisingly, dozens of people from Thorndale, community members who'd never met Alana, but came to honor the woman who'd given them justice when no one else would. They stood in solidarity, a living testament to the impact of her final act of courage. Hudson spoke briefly, his words simple but powerful. Alana Reeves called my number by accident one night when she was scared and alone. That wrong number changed both our lives. She taught me that courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about doing the right thing even when you're terrified, even when it costs you everything. She gave my community justice. She gave me back the ability to trust. And she reminded my daughter that one person choosing truth can change the world. Bailey placed a single white rose on the casket, whispering something Hudson couldn't hear. Later, she told him she'd promised to take care of her father, to make sure he didn't forget how to be happy, to remember that Alana had wanted them to live fully, not just survive. The reading of Alana's will brought surprises. Beyond the foundation restructuring, she'd established trust funds for every family in Thorndale affected by the contamination, funded from her personal assets rather than Reeves' money. She'd left detailed instructions for the scholarships in Sarah's name. With the first recipient already selected, a Thorndale High School senior pursuing environmental engineering, whose mother had died from the same lymphoma that took both Sarah and Alana. To Bailey, Alana left her collection of classical music recordings and a letter to be opened on her 16th birthday. To Hudson, she left something more complicated, a request. She wanted you to write her story, the estate lawyer explained, handing Hudson a sealed envelope. Not a sanitized corporate biography, but the truth. The loneliness, the difficult choices, the midnight phone calls. She said you were the only person who really knew her, and she wanted that person preserved honestly. Hudson opened the envelope alone that night after Bailey was asleep. Inside was a letter in Alana's elegant handwriting, composed during one of her last coherent days. Dear Hudson, if you're reading this, I've finally escaped this failing body, which is honestly a relief. I hope the service wasn't too maudlin. I left instructions for something simple, but knowing my father, he probably ignored them in favor of something appropriately grand. I'm writing to ask you for something that might seem strange. I want you to tell our story. Not for publicity or sympathy, but because I think it matters. Not just what happened with Reeves Pharmaceutical, though that's important, but the story of two lonely people who found connection in the strangest circumstances, who learned to trust after loss, who discovered that the most meaningful relationships sometimes start with wrong numbers and 3 a.m. phone calls. I've spent my life being defined by other people, my father's daughter, the pharmaceutical heiress, the tragic cancer patient. You're the only person who saw me as just Alana, someone who liked Chopin and missed playing piano, someone who was scared of dying alone, someone who needed to be brave but didn't always know how to write about that person, Hudson. Write about the woman who took weeks to find her courage because she was human and flawed and terrified. Write about how Bailey's letter gave me strength when I had none. Write about how talking to you made me feel less like a diagnosis and more like a person. But also write about you. About a father raising his daughter alone while fighting for justice. About a baker with calloused hands and a generous heart. About someone who answered a stranger's desperate call at 3 a.m. and stayed on the line because it was the decent thing to do. Our story won't be made into movies or taught in business schools. But maybe it will matter to someone else out there who feels alone, who's struggling with impossible choices, who needs to know that connection can happen in unexpected ways, and that doing the right thing is never simple, but always worth it. I don't have many regrets, Hudson. Most of my life was wasted on things that didn't matter, but these past weeks with you felt significant in ways I can't fully articulate. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for forgiving me. Thank you for calling at 9 o'clock every night, even when I knew you were exhausted from work and worried about Bailey. Take care of that remarkable daughter of yours. Take the foundation position. I know you haven't decided yet, but I'm betting you will. Live fully, not carefully. Sarah was right about that. I suspect about most things. And if someday you find yourself helping another lonely person at 3 a.m., remember that small acts of kindness ripple further than we can see. With gratitude and affection. Alina. P.S. Bailey asked me once what legacy meant. I told her it's not about buildings with your name on them or how much money you leave behind. It's about the lives you touch and whether the world is slightly better because you were in it. You and Bailey are my legacy, Hudson. You're proof that I mattered to someone. That's enough. Hudson read the letter 3 times, tears streaming freely. Then he pulled out his laptop and began to write. 6 months later, the Catherine Reeves Foundation had transformed into a powerhouse of environmental justice advocacy. Hudson had accepted the board position, bringing practical perspective to policy discussions. His bakery had promoted him to day shift supervisor, allowing better hours for foundation work and time with Bailey. The dual roles felt right, balanced between honest labor and meaningful advocacy. The foundation's first major initiative funded comprehensive health monitoring in 15 communities nationwide, with suspected industrial contamination. The second established a legal aid network helping families sue corporations for environmental negligence. The third created the scholarship program in Sarah's name, which had already awarded funding to 23 students from affected communities. Hudson had written Alana's story as she'd requested, a book that balanced her corporate privilege with her ultimate choice for justice. It wasn't a bestseller, but it found its audience. People struggling with ethical dilemmas, families dealing with corporate negligence, anyone who'd ever felt trapped between loyalty and truth. The modest royalties went entirely to the foundation. Bailey had thrown herself into environmental activism with the passionate intensity of adolescence channeled productively. She spoke at community meetings, helped organize protests, volunteered at the foundation offices. Her science fair project on tracking contamination patterns had won state recognition, catching attention from universities already recruiting the talented 13-year-old. Mom would be proud, Hudson told her after one particularly eloquent speech to City Council about environmental protections. Alana would be too, Bailey replied. I wish she could have seen this. I think she knew, Hudson said. She believed in you before she'd even met you. The Thorndale facility had been shut down pending criminal proceedings against Reeves pharmaceutical executives. Harrison Reeves had resigned in disgrace, his legacy permanently tarnished by the scandal his daughter had exposed. The company was in bankruptcy, its assets being liquidated to pay settlements to affected families. It was messy and painful and necessary. Hudson had been offered a settlement as part of the class action lawsuit, compensation for Sarah's death, for his family's suffering, for years of fighting an unjust system. The amount was substantial, enough to change his and Bailey's lives materially. He'd accepted it without guilt. Sarah's death deserved acknowledgement. Their struggle deserved recognition. With part of the settlement, he'd bought a small house in a neighborhood with clean water and good schools, finally leaving behind the apartment filled with memories of loss. With another part, he'd established a scholarship at Bailey's school for students pursuing environmental studies. The rest he'd invested conservatively for Bailey's future education. On the anniversary of Alana's death, Hudson and Bailey visited her grave. Not the elaborate family mausoleum where Harrison had insisted she be interred, but a simple marker they'd privately placed in a community garden the foundation had established in Thorndale. Alana would have preferred this, Hudson thought, surrounded by growing things. In the neighborhood she'd helped heal. Rather than isolated in marble grandeur, Bailey placed fresh flowers on the marker, which read simply, Alana Reeves. She chose truth. She mattered. I miss her, Bailey said quietly, even though I only knew her for a little while. Me too, Bailebug. Me too. They sat in the garden's peaceful quiet, watching families use the space that had been created from tragedy and transformation. The garden featured native plants selected for their ability to filter contaminants from soil. In the center, a fountain cycled purified water, both symbolic and functional. Children played nearby, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Dad, Bailey said after a while, do you think you'll ever fall in love again? The question caught Hudson off guard. I don't know. Maybe someday. Would that bother you? No, Bailey said thoughtfully. I think Mom would want you to be happy. And I think Alana would too. She said in her letter to me that loving people was never wrong, even when it hurt. That staying open to connection was the bravest thing anyone could do. Hudson pulled his daughter close, grateful beyond measure for her wisdom and resilience. When did you get so smart? I learned from good teachers, Bailey replied. Mom taught me that doing hard things matters. You taught me that showing up matters. And Alana taught me that sometimes the most important connections come from the most unexpected places. As they walked home through Thorndale's gradually revitalizing streets, past houses where families affected by contamination were finally receiving justice and support. Hudson felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not the absence of grief, which still surfaced at unexpected moments, but the presence of purpose. Sarah's death hadn't been meaningless. Alana's life hadn't been wasted. And his own journey from devastating loss to hard-won healing had value, both in what he'd survived and in how he'd chosen to rebuild. That night, Hudson sat at his desk, working on the Foundation's quarterly report. His phone showed 9 p.m., the time when Alana used to call. For 6 months after her death, that hour had been painful, marked by absence. But tonight, Hudson felt only gratitude. A wrong number at 2:47 a.m. had connected two people who desperately needed each other. A dying woman had found courage to expose injustice. A grieving widower had learned to trust again. A young girl had gained an unexpected mentor who'd shown her the power of choosing truth over comfort. The ripples continued outward. Communities receiving justice, families finding support, students pursuing careers in environmental protection, corporate accountability slowly, painfully being enforced. Hudson's phone buzzed with a text from one of the Foundation lawyers. Another community had come forward with evidence of contamination, requesting help. He responded quickly, setting up a meeting, already planning how to approach the case. Sarah had been right. All those years ago when she'd talked about infrastructure holding society together. But it wasn't just physical infrastructure, pipes and bridges and water systems. It was also the human infrastructure of connection, of people choosing to show up for each other, of small acts of courage that combined into movements for change. Alana had called the wrong number on a desperate night. Hudson had answered when he could have ignored it. Everything that followed, all the complexity and pain and ultimate transformation, had stemmed from that single choice to stay on the line. Some connections were meant to be, Hudson thought. Even the ones that started by accident. Especially those ones outside his window. Ashmont City glittered under the night sky. 42 floors below, where Alana had once stood looking at the same view, feeling isolated despite being surrounded by millions. She wasn't alone anymore. Her legacy lived in every family receiving justice, every student pursuing her scholarship, every community fighting back against corporate negligence. And she lived in Hudson's memory, in Bailey's determination, in the simple truth that one person choosing courage could change everything. The phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. An unknown number. Hudson smiled and answered, "Hello?" A trembling voice came through, unfamiliar and frightened. "I'm sorry, I think I have the wrong number, but I don't know who else to call." Hudson settled back in his chair, recognizing desperation when he heard it. Some things he'd learned were worth answering, even at night, even when tired. Especially then. "You've reached the right place," he said gently. "Tell me what's wrong. I'm listening." The auditorium at Stanford University buzzed with the energy of graduation day. Hudson Vaughn sat in the audience section reserved for families, his hair showing more gray now at 51, his face carrying lines earned through years of meaningful work rather than mere survival. Beside him sat Emma Chun, the environmental attorney he'd married 3 years ago, whose steady presence had taught him that hearts could expand rather than replace. They watched as Bailey Lynn Vaughn crossed the stage to receive her master's degree in environmental engineering, graduating top of her class at 23. Her thesis on innovative water purification systems for contaminated communities had already attracted attention from both academic institutions and advocacy organizations. Sarah would have been so proud, Emma whispered, squeezing Hudson's hand. She'd never met Sarah, but she honored her memory naturally, understanding that loving Hudson meant embracing all he'd been before they met. She would have, Hudson agreed, his voice thick with emotion. Alana, too. After the ceremony, Bailey found them in the crowd, her graduation gown billowing in the California breeze, her smile radiant. "Dr. Morrison offered me a position with his research team," she announced. barely containing her excitement. Working on the contamination reversal project in Thorndale. Full funding, my own lab time, everything. Thorndale, Hudson repeated, the word carrying weight. The neighborhood had transformed dramatically over the decades since Alana's revelations. The Reeves facility had been demolished and the land converted into a community wellness center. Water quality had improved steadily through remediation efforts. Cancer rates were finally declining toward normal levels. I know it's where it all started, Bailey said, more seriously now. Where Mom got sick, where Alana's choice changed everything. It feels right to go back there, to help finish what they started. Hudson pulled his daughter into a tight embrace. It's perfect. You're going to do amazing work. That evening, at the celebratory dinner, Bailey pulled out a worn envelope. I've been carrying this around all day. Today's my 23rd birthday, not my 16th, but close enough. I think it's time. Hudson recognized the envelope immediately. Alana's letter to Bailey, the one she'd left with instructions to open on her 16th birthday. Bailey had chosen to wait, saying she'd know when the moment was right. She opened it carefully, unfolding pages covered in Alana's distinctive handwriting. As she read, tears streamed down her face. Finally, she looked up at her father. She wrote about you, Bailey said softly. About how talking to you saved her in those final weeks. But she also wrote about me. She cleared her throat and read aloud, Dear Bailey, by the time you read this, you'll be becoming the woman I only got glimpses of. I hope you've stayed curious and brave. I hope you've pursued your passion for science and justice. I hope your father has found happiness again, because he deserves it more than anyone I've known. I'm writing to tell you something important. You changed my life as much as your father did. Your letter, the one where you told me the hardest things are usually the most important things, gave me courage when I had none left. You reminded me that truth matters more than comfort, that standing up is worth the cost of standing alone. You asked me once what legacy means. Now I'm asking you, what will yours be? You have gifts, intelligence, compassion, determination. You have the benefit of seeing both privilege and struggle through your father's eyes. You understand that systems can be broken and that individuals can fix them. Don't waste these gifts on safe choices. Take risks for things that matter. Stand up when it's hard. Connect with people across divides. Remember that the most important work often starts with showing up for one stranger at the right moment. Your father answered a desperate call at 3 a.m. because it was the decent thing to do. That single act of kindness rippled into justice for thousands of families. Never underestimate the power of choosing compassion over convenience. I won't be there to see the extraordinary things you'll accomplish, but I believe in you completely. Make the world better, Bailey. Not someday, but starting now with whatever you have, wherever you are, with love and faith in your future, Alana. The table was silent for a long moment. Emma dabbed at her eyes. Hudson reached across to squeeze Bailey's hand. She was right about you, Hudson said. About everything. I'm going to frame this, Bailey decided. Hang it in my new lab in Thorndale. So I remember why the work matters when it gets hard. Later, walking across Stanford's campus in the cooling evening air, Hudson found himself at the music building. Through an open window, someone was practicing Chopin's Nocturne Opus 9. Number 2, the piece Alana had recommended to him a decade ago. The melody that had accompanied so many late-night hours of work and reflection. He stopped to listen, remembering that first desperate phone call. The weeks of conversation that followed, the impossible choice Alana had made. Her death had felt like an ending then. But standing here now, watching his daughter prepare to carry forward work that Alana had started, Hudson understood it had been a beginning. The Catherine Reeves Foundation had grown into a national force for environmental justice. The scholarships in Sarah's name had funded over 200 students. The legal network had helped dozens of communities hold corporations accountable. Bailey was one of many young advocates inspired by Alana's story. By proof that one person's courage could cascade into systemic change, Hudson pulled out his phone, scrolling to a saved voicemail he'd kept for 10 years. Alana's voice from one of their last conversations. "Thank you for answering when I called. Thank you for staying on the line. You saved me, Hudson. Not from dying, but from dying alone and meaningless. That's everything. You saved me too," Hudson whispered to the memory. "You both did." The piano music continued, melancholy and beautiful, carrying across the campus where Alana had once studied, where Bailey had just graduated, where countless other students were beginning journeys that would intersect with others in unexpected ways. Some connections were meant to be. Hudson thought, even the ones that started by accident. Especially those ones. Because sometimes a wrong number was exactly the right call. And sometimes staying on the line when someone asked was the most important thing you could do. The music faded as the pianist finished. Hudson stood in the gathering darkness, feeling Sarah's presence in the evening breeze. Alana's legacy in the life his daughter was about to begin, and gratitude for the unexpected paths that had led him here. Then he walked back to where Emma and Bailey waited, ready to celebrate the future they were all building together. One conversation, one choice, one act of courage at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.